Today's video is a bit different to usual. I'm going to make something from somebody else's design, and here's a quick message from them to tell you more about it.
Hey Neil, it's John Heisz from I Build It. A little while ago, I built my ultimate wooden clamps as a tutorial on the Maker's Mob, and now I'm challenging you to make them your own. I know you'll do a great job, and I can't wait to see how they turn out.
Thanks, John. This should be a fun one. I've downloaded the plans from the Maker's Mob, so let's prepare some wood and get started. And for the wood, I'm using black wattle. So the challenge is to make the clamps and try and make them my own, and that's not the easiest task as they're already the ultimate clamp. Anyway, I can't improve on the functionality of them, so instead I'm going to go way over the top and try and make them super fancy. That's the black wattle milled, and I have one board a touch thicker than the other, and all the wood parts will come from these pieces. I'll rip down and cut all the pieces to length, and I'm keeping to John's dimensions. I always enjoy making something from someone else's plans as the thinking's already done and I can just get on with it. Make sure to check out my challenge for John and also the other makers on the Maker's Mob who are all challenging each other too. I'm making two clamps, and this is the pieces all laid out. The thicker pieces are for the moving jaw, and next I need to take off a small taper which will be clearance for a spring. The spring is just a thin piece of wood that I cut off camera, and that gets glued on with regular wood glue. So far I haven't done anything different to John's clamps, but don't worry, they're definitely going to be quite a bit different, so make sure to keep watching. The spring works really well. On the opposite side of the moving jaw, I need to add a piece of an old sanding belt, and that's to help the clamp grip the bar. And the last thing to do to these parts is sand another small taper for some clearance. This is where things get different. To hold the parts together, I'm using brass for the outer layers instead of wood. It'll make far more work and they'll be much heavier, but there's some fun procedures involved, including a stacked leather handle, and they should turn out pretty neat. Of course, it is a bit ridiculous as a clamp just needs the clamp, but I love challenges like this as you get to make things that you never would have done, and some of these procedures can be carried into future projects, so it's all good practice. Because I'm using brass, I'll need to use epoxy to hold it all together, but I can't rely solely on the epoxy, so I'll need to pin it too, and here I'm drilling the holes for the pins. I'm lining the pieces up, holding them in the vise and drilling through all the layers. This will also help when I come to glue them together as they'll easily locate into the correct position. That's the fixed jaw drilled, now I'll do the moving jaw. It's starting to look a bit like a clamp. Next I'll make the moving jaw pad, and that will be the same method with a wooden block sandwiched between two pieces of brass. Join myself, Jimmy DeResta, the Samurai Carpenter, John Peters, Frank Howarth, and John Heisz for the Makers Mob annual Black Friday Cyber Monday sale. We've put together 27 of our most popular plans. I've also made sure that my mini workbench project is in there, all with step-by-step video tutorials for just 99 cents. To access our biggest sale of the year, simply click the link in the description below, as this offer does end Monday at midnight, and I'll be sure to see you on the inside. I decided that there wasn't enough brass in the project, so I thought I'd add a brass logo too. I'm drilling the recess with a parser drill, but many of you would know that from my recent video where I made it. It's pretty cool and can drill just about any shaped hole. There's still a few things need doing before I can glue all the pieces together. First, I need to sand and clean up the inside faces of the brass. Next, I need to slightly taper the pinholes, and I'm doing that with a modified spade bit. And the reason for tapering them is the pins will get peened over, they'll fill the taper, locking all the pieces together. Next, I'll give all the glue surfaces, including the wood, a clean with acetone, and this will give the epoxy the best chance of sticking. The pins are quite important, as they need to be just the right length and the ends need rounding over too. This will help when I peen them later on to lock all the pieces together. Everything is prepped, so now I can glue all the pieces together. There's a fair amount of work involved to make these from brass, and it would be so much easier just gluing and nailing wooden outside layers on, but it's just what you have to do if you're making fancy clamps. While they're drying, I'll start the handles, and they'll be stacked leather just like this hammer that I rehandled a few years ago. I've got a bag of leather scraps that are perfect for this, and next I'll punch out some discs. I'm using this crude punch that I made from an old piece of pipe, and it literally took a minute to grind the bevel on it. I need to punch the center out of the discs, and I was going to do it in the same way, but it didn't take long at all to put this setup together on the fly press, and the fly press is always fun to use. The pipe is just a very cheap chromed offcut that I found in the scrap bucket. The leather needs to be compressed, and to do that I'll make end caps and ferrules from, you guessed it, another piece of brass. I'm starting with an end cap, and I'm cutting a 30-degree bevel on it. I'll mount it back in the chuck and it's reversed so I can drill a hole ready for tapping. The tap is bottoming out and I could do with a couple more threads in there, so I'll use this cheap tap that's had the leading taper section ground off. Here's the rest of the pieces finished off camera. The ferrules had a 25-degree taper cut on them and the holes are through holes. To glue the pieces together, I'm using epoxy again. I'm making sure to line the facets up on the cap to the ferrule. I'll put those aside to dry and I'll get back to the clamps. The rounded ends of the pins have less chance of splitting, and that's the reason why it's worth putting the effort in and prepare them properly. If you just put the pins in oversized, cut them down and pin them like that, then they're very likely to split. It wouldn't take too long to sand the pins down on the belt grinder or any other sander, but brass gets hot fast and the epoxy would start to melt. To avoid that, I'm sanding them by hand. The faces are sanded to 180 grit and that will do for now. Next I'll trim up and sand the edges. I'm using the sander to clean up the edges, but to avoid getting the brass hot, I'm sanding each edge for a short time and then moving on to the next edge. And then I put that piece aside and I go to the next piece and I do the same and so on until they're all done. That's all the edges cleaned up. Next I can drill the holes in the moving jaw for the clamp screw, and while I'm drilling I also drilled the moving jaw pad too, and this piece needs a recess for a nut to turn in, so I did that with an end mill. The moving jaw needs a fixed nut. In the original clamps, John used the T-nut, which is perfect. It's a little bit big for mine as I don't have the thicker wooden sides. Also, it looks a bit cheap for a fancy clamp, so instead I'll cut a recess for a stainless steel nut. Using a hacksaw, I put a cut into each of the points of the nut to give the epoxy something to grab onto. I'll let those set and get back to the handles, and I'll do most of the sanding on the belt grinder, starting with a 50 grit belt to remove most of the waste. That's the shape just about roughed in. Now I'll swap the belt for a 120 grit to refine it a bit more. I reckon the handles look great and definitely something that could be used in other projects. Let me know what tools you reckon they'd work well on, and maybe I could add them to my list of future projects. Before I assemble the clamps, I'll take all the corners off with a file and do some more sanding. I'm not going for a super high finish, as I like brass when a patina is built up, like on this knife I made a couple of years ago. A nut needs to be fixed on the end of the screw and it needs to turn inside the recess. Because these nuts are a bit too big, I rounded one off on the belt grinder. To stop the nut from coming off, I peen and distort it to lock it onto the screw. It needs some grease on the end before putting on a washer and gluing on a clamp pad. The last thing it needs is some finish, and I'm doing that with water-based varnish. I've only put one coat of varnish on to finish the video, but I will put another one on. Anyway, let's try it out and see how they go. And not only is it fancy, it works great too, and I reckon it'll look better once it's aged a bit and that patina starts to develop. I really enjoyed this project, as I always like making tools, and using brass is always fun, even if the clamps were a bit over the top. They really are a great clamp and can be made much easier than my ones. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe. Don't forget to check out the Makers Mob Black Friday sale and also the other Makers Challenge videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.